You probably have more rotation for your golf swing than you think, but let's talk about how you can unlock this if you are struggling to rotate as much as you would like. I hear it all the time from players when I try to get them to turn more, that they don't have the best mobility so they can't, or they're tight and they can't turn, or when they do turn it starts to hurt the lower back and they have low back pain. So of course there are players who have had injuries and they actually have decreased mobility or restrictions, but a lot of us do not, and let's talk about how the setup is going to hinder you from rotating. So we are going to work from the ground up, kind of working with the feet. We'll get into some knee positioning and then finish with the pelvis, going over a few quick points here. So the first thing is going to be a simple one, the stance being overly wide. I see players all the time that will get set up something like this with a 7-iron in their hands. And when your stance is this wide, you can effectively transfer weight, but it is very hard to rotate the body when the stance starts to get as wide as this. This is where ideally the stance, of course, I don't want to see it too narrow because now you can rotate, but it's going to be very unstable. We want to find that happy medium. So a quick kind of guide is going to be when we have wedges and short irons. I like to see the inside of the heels right about hip width. When we get into kind of mid to long irons, go ahead and widen out about a ball width with each foot, where now the inside of the heels here are going to be about outer hip width. And then when you get closer to driver, inside heels can get a little bit closer to shoulder width. Just a general guide there. Everyone's a little different, but you want to avoid the extremes of getting too wide. So the next is going to be having the toes toed in too much. And this is not one of those things where more is always better, but I will see players get in here where their toes are almost knocked in slightly. This is another thing that is going to make it very hard for you to rotate the hips. When it's hard to rotate the hips, you aren't going to be able to rotate the upper body very effectively. As soon as those hips stop, the upper body is not far to follow. So getting the toes a little bit too toed in is going to make rotation very hard for most. Again, I don't want to see you getting here where your toes are way out, but if we can add, if say this is kind of neutral and through here where the toes are straight ahead, you can add about an inch or half an inch of flare to that back foot, call it about an inch to 2 inches on that front foot. That can give you a little bit more freedom throughout the hips to allow you to rotate, which will free up more rotation in the shoulders and upper body for you. Now let's move to the knees. I see players all the time get way too squatty in through the knees and really get these knees bent, where now when I'm set up here, I start to get the knees a little bit more out over top of the toes. Ideally, just as a general guide, I want to see the knees when you're standing straight up here. When these knees bend, they should stay slightly back behind the knots in your shoelaces, or they should feel like they're a little bit more over top of the ankle joint, not getting the knees way out over the toe. Once I start to get a little too squatty here, rotation becomes very difficult, very hard to turn into this back leg. As soon as I start to straighten the knees out slightly, round through the spine rather than squatting the knees and getting very upright through the torso, straighten those knees, relax the spine, can almost guarantee you it's going to become easier to turn into this back hip and lengthen out through this leg. Now let's look at the knees from a face-on view. The other thing that I will see players do is get way too bowed throughout the knees here. So I will see players that may have the knees straight enough or have a slight bend to them when we are looking on this down the line view. But then when we go face on, I will see players all the time that will really get the knees bowed out like this, thinking it's making them a little bit more stable, where you really get these kneecaps angled outwards. Not saying you have to get your knees knocked into the point where your knees are pointing towards each other and they're very close, but getting the knees overly wide. I always see it, especially when players go to flare the toes, is they will go from this position, flare the toes, and now the knees go with it. And when the knees get real wide like this, again, very hard to turn into this back hip, which will restrict the upper body big time. So what I would like to see is when you do flare the toes, you can flare the toes slightly, but you need to make sure that the knees stay slightly pointed inwards, or pointed inwards more than they currently are, to the point where these kneecaps are basically straight ahead. So we want to add a little bit of toe flare, but let the kneecap stay straight ahead, slightly in, and that is again going to free up rotation for you big time. So probably most important when we are looking at all of this, and this is going to kind of come down to the pelvis and the hips. We're going to move up a little bit. And this is the last one that I will mention, is I will see players all the time get the back very hyper extended, or they will really kick the glutes back and almost angle the belt buckle down towards the ground. If we're going to get technical, it's a position called anterior pelvic tilt. You have too much tipping forward of your hips and your pelvis, really getting them angled very downwards with the belt buckle kind of pointing down towards the golf ball. Big arch in the lower back here. That is going to probably be the biggest thing that I see when it comes to restricting rotation and having back pain. So if that is the case and you are a player that notices, man, I really do get my butt sticked out, I get a big arch or dip in the lower back here, what you have to feel is almost like you are taking your tailbone and tucking it up underneath of your heels. You need to feel like you go and get into this position and really tuck that pelvis underneath of you, feeling like that belt buckle is getting a little bit more level to the ground, really feeling like those glutes are pulling underneath of you to the point that this lower back flattens out and the glutes are not too far back behind these heels here. I don't want to see it to the point where these glutes get way back behind the heels. So that kind of goes back to the excessive knee bend. I will see that quite a bit where players will really bend in the knees and then kind of push the lower back into this arch position, glutes back, stay real tall through the chest, getting into a position like this. Probably the worst position you can be in, especially when it comes to causing back pain. This is going to put a ton of stress on that low back. So a lot of times those two will go together, where I would like to see the knees straighten out, feel like that pelvis tucks underneath of you, feel like your chest rounds down a little bit, and that's going to get you into a position where you're going to be able to rotate much more freely and not have the stress and the pain and the restriction throughout the pelvis and the low back area there.